So we're going to continue our series on love today. Jesus talked about love as being the key principle of the New Testament. The one thing that God wanted from us all, that if we had it, we had everything, and if we lost it, we had nothing. It was Jesus' first and second commands to his disciples, that they love God and that they love each other. And love takes a huge amount of effort and dedication to people who don't always deserve to be loved. And the truth that the Bible teaches is that none of us really deserves to be loved, but God, the miracle of God, is that he loves us anyway. God commands that we love each other, and it takes effort. Some people don't seem to be very lovable. We may wonder at times about all the people we've loved or whom we've looked over and we've seen loved by so many other people, and they still act like dirty rats. You ever wonder about the people like that? What about them? Is love a waste of time? I've seen young men whose mothers loved them, and it took 30 years for the boy to change and to start acting responsibly. Was it worth it? It's a tough job to be a mom or a dad. You can't make your children's decisions. You can only love them and hope for the best. And so we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 13 again today, and we're going to start in verse 8. 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 8. There are study questions that go along with today's lesson out in the foyer. You should have seen those with the bulletin as you picked it up, but if you're looking for those, they'll be right there beside the bulletin. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 writes, starting verse 8, love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. So love never fails, Paul says. That statement seems to go against our experiences, doesn't it? Because, saw a man post in Facebook this past week that he had watched a movie recently, The Notebook. You ever seen The Notebook? Came out about 10 years ago, I think, something like that. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's a terrific movie. And so I'm going to spoil it for you today. If you haven't watched it by now, you had your chance, but it's a story about a man and a woman who fall in love, a poor boy who courts a rich girl, pursues a rich girl, and the story reflects back from the time when they are older. He's an old man reading a story to this old woman who doesn't know who he is. She has Alzheimer's disease. And he reads this long story of their betrothal, and through the movie, they get to this point where, for a moment, she remembers. And it's a great and wonderful feeling for that moment. But the Alzheimer's then kicks in, and she forgets it all. She even forgets who he is, his name. And every now and then I think about how most people probably don't even remember it all. They get old, their personality changes. You end up with two strangers sometimes living in the same place through the last years of their lives. And we wonder what happened to love. Did it fail? But the reason why I think that movie is so powerful is because it illustrates what love does and its success, the reason why love doesn't fail. The man just keeps loving his wife. He keeps reading to her the story that it turns out she wrote so that she would remember. That's love's ultimate power, to never fail. Love has that superpower. It says that prophecies will cease. It doesn't say when. I believe that they still exist today. You believe that they've been done away with. It doesn't matter. I believe that they belong to a time in the past. You believe that prophecies still continue. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. The point that Paul makes is love never fails. It endures beyond the things that we don't know. It's more important. It always hopes. It always trusts, even when it seems a very unlikely investment. Love never fails because it holds churches together that are composed of Corinthians with opposing views on almost everything. They disagreed on spiritual gifts. And that's evident. That's what he's talking about in chapters 12 through 14. Their disagreement on spiritual gifts. They disagreed about their leaders, who their leaders were. And that's clearly stated in chapters 1 and 3. They misunderstood immorality. And Paul's response is that can be cleaned up. It can be changed, dealt with, and forgiven. They had varying opinions on the powers of idols, whether idols really existed, whether they had any power at all, whether you could eat the meat sacrificed to them because they might have some of that latent power hanging around. In 2 Corinthians, Paul reveals they had discrepancies and disagreements about whether Paul was an apostle or not, and who the greater apostles were. We argue about things like that today, not necessarily that particular topic. We pick out different issues, don't we? But there is still a church, and so Paul loved them, and God loved them. Love never fails. It never fails because it keeps on loving. It's triumphant because it loves when people's other emotions tell them to give up on each other and to quarrel until their own viewpoint wins. The viewpoint that should win, Paul says, is that we should keep on loving and never fail to love. And with regard to spiritual gifts, love directs Christians to use their gifts to benefit each other. The gifts, including prophecy and speaking in tongues and knowledge, are temporary. And so Paul says those things are going to just pass away. They seemed really important, but they're gifts that were needed in this age only. Paul isn't condemning the gifts, and he's not forbidding the gifts. He's comparing the gifts to love, and he says they're just not as important. Love should guide how the gifts get used. Love will be around in heaven and hereafter, he says. Love's the thing that's going to endure. Paul tells us that the gifts are partial. I wonder what does he mean by that? We only know in part. We can only prophesy in part. Why is that? Because we belong to this age that we live in, an age that's on its way out. It's moving toward an end where we'll be with God, the perfect end, the ultimate victory. And when we get there, we won't just know in part. We will have the full story. The gifts that we used to build each other up won't be necessary anymore because we'll have the answers. We'll have all the answers. We will reach perfection that God intends, where we love each other as He designed us. Love will never fail. Only a lack of love will fail. Only when you stop loving other people do you fail. I think many people look at certain things in life, they look at certain sin events, they think failure has occurred, and it has. Sin destroys other people's lives, and it destroys our very selves. We have to beat the temptation in our lives to be selfish or argumentative or lustful or greedy or proud. But whatever mistakes a person makes, you can still love them. That's one of the things that Paul teaches, Jesus teaches, even as you encourage them to change. Let's turn over to 1 Peter chapter 4. I want to start in verse 7, passage there. Peter writes, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. And above all, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, he should do it as one speaking the very words of God. If anyone serves, he should do it with the strength God supplies, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. You know, I never noticed before I read this week how similar this passage written by Peter is to at least the little snippet we just read from Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. He's talking about the end of time being near. He talks about this age, about loving each other. Love is placed above all things in Peter's teaching. Peter refers to spiritual gifts and how those gifts should be used to serve each other. He who serves, he who teaches, all those things should be done to build other people up, just as Paul says in chapters 12 through 14. And he also then makes this famous statement that love covers over a multitude of sins. That's another great and crazy statement, isn't it? Love covers over a multitude of sins. Can you just cover up your sins? In our world, we thrive on rooting out people's sins, don't we? Cover-up's a bad thing. We plaster people's sins on TV or in the newspaper. Maybe sins make Facebook more interesting. Maybe some people even think that they can sin and just love more to make up for it, and that would be a misconstrual, I think, of what Peter intends here. But hopefully it works out. Peter is saying, just like Paul, that our first focus should be on love. Other things like spiritual gifts are guided by how we use them to love others. If you make mistakes in this life, don't let them be mistakes of failing to love people. And when I think about the various arguments that I've heard in churches, I go back to thinking about this teaching, how so easily it gets brushed aside. In 1 Peter 8, in verse 8 here, Peter says, above all, love each other deeply. All the differences, all the opinions people had. If you did all that, love would certainly never fail. All the disagreements churches have, all the things that people have about opinions, all the doctrines that we teach. It's kind of funny to me, nobody really argues about love. You shouldn't argue about love. You kind of already know you've kind of failed when you start arguing about it, right? If you follow that doctrine, you can't control how or whether someone will love you back. That's not how it succeeds or fails. But you can control how you love other people. And you can keep loving them even when they don't deserve it.